It was an ordinary evening, one of those times when the air had a slight chill and the last traces of sunlight disappeared over the horizon. My neighbor, Mr. Walters, was known for his oddities. He was a reclusive man who kept to himself most of the time. I had lived in this quiet neighborhood for years, and although I never really interacted with Mr. Walters, I could tell there was something unsettling about him. That night after dinner, I decided to take a walk around the block to clear my head. It had been a stressful week at work, and I needed a little mental break. As I walked down the sidewalk, I noticed Mr. Walters' porch light was flickering on and off. I had never seen it do that before, and it caught my attention. The house had always seemed old and worn out, but now, with the light glitching, it looked even more foreboding. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a light bulb issue, but as I continued my walk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, I received a knock on my door. It was Mr. Walters. He had a strange look in his eyes, something distant, almost vacant, like he wasn't fully present in the moment. He asked if I had noticed anything strange happening around the neighborhood lately, but his tone was more urgent than casual. I told him I hadn't, and I even mentioned his porch light seemed to be malfunctioning. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he stared at me for a moment, then turned and walked back toward his house without another word. That night, things took a turn for the worse. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of banging coming from next door. I glanced at the clock. It was 12:05 a.m. At first, I thought it was just someone moving furniture or maybe a neighbor having a late-night argument, but the banging grew louder and more frantic. It sounded like something or someone was trying to break down a door. I got out of bed and walked to the window, pulling the curtains aside just enough to peek outside. Mr. Walters' house was shrouded in darkness, save for the faint light coming from his bedroom window. But then I saw it. A shadow moving inside his house, pacing back and forth. I watched in confusion, unable to make sense of it. What was going on? Was Mr. Walters okay? The banging continued for what felt like an eternity, until suddenly it stopped, just as abruptly as it had started. I stood frozen by the window for a few more minutes, unsure whether to call the police. But before I could make a decision, I saw something that made my blood run cold. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement near my front porch. I turned to look and saw Mr. Walters standing in the middle of my yard. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring straight ahead. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his face was pale, almost sickly. A chill ran down my spine as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. How had he gotten there? He hadn't knocked on my door. How long had he been standing there? I quickly backed away from the window and ducked behind the curtains, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to interact with Mr. Walters. Not like this. Not after what I had just witnessed. I stood in the dark, trying to control my breathing, praying he hadn't seen me. The minutes dragged on, but I didn't dare look back outside. My mind raced with possibilities. What had happened inside his house? Why was he acting so strange? Eventually, I heard the sound of footsteps moving away from my porch. He was gone. I waited for what felt like an eternity before finally daring to peek outside again. The yard was empty, and the street was quiet. It seemed like everything was normal once more. The next morning, I was exhausted from the lack of sleep, but I still had to go to work. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened during the night. I went about my day, trying to distract myself, but the thoughts kept gnawing at the back of my mind. What was Mr. Walters involved in? Why was he behaving so erratically? When I returned home later that afternoon, I found a note slipped under my door. The handwriting was erratic, jagged, like it had been written in a hurry. It was from Mr. Walters. "I know you saw me. Don't tell anyone what you saw. You don't know what's inside this house. Please, for your own sake, don't ask questions." I felt a wave of nausea sweep over me. What had he meant by that? What was he hiding? And what did he mean by what's inside this house? The note left me more terrified than ever. That evening, I decided to take a walk again, hoping the fresh air would calm my nerves. As I passed by Mr. Walters' house, I felt the weight of his words pressing down on me. I tried to ignore the sensation, but it was impossible. His house was still standing there, dark and silent, like it had always been. But something felt different. The atmosphere seemed heavier, suffocating almost. I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from inside his house. I had nearly reached the end of the block when I heard a voice, Mr. Walters' voice, calling my name. My stomach dropped. I turned slowly, but there was no one in sight. I heard it again, this time closer, coming from the darkness near his porch. I didn't want to go any closer, but the voice seemed to pull me in, like it was beckoning me. "Help me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Please, you have to help me." I hesitated, unsure whether I was hearing things or if it was truly Mr. Walters. I couldn't stand there all night, so I quickly turned and walked away, keeping my pace brisk. But the whole time, I could feel his eyes on me. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows, making sure I was as secure as possible. I spent the night on edge, too scared to fall asleep. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I finally managed to drift off. The next day, I found myself standing in front of Mr. Walters' house, unable to stop myself. I knew I should stay away. I knew I should call the police, but something compelled me to go closer to learn the truth. As I stood in front of his porch, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. The darkness inside seemed to swallow everything around it, but there was a faint, unsettling noise coming from within, like whispering voices. Without thinking, I pushed the door open. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a coldness, a presence that made my skin crawl. It was as though the house itself was alive, watching me. The air was thick, oppressive. My mind raced as I walked deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I reached the living room, and there, sitting in the corner, was Mr. Walters. He was no longer the man I had seen before. His face was contorted with terror, his eyes wide with madness. And then, from behind him, something moved. I barely had time to react before the figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, thin, its face hidden by a hood. It had a hollow, ghastly presence, like it didn't belong in this world. Before I could scream, I felt a sharp, icy hand clamp down on my shoulder. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered in a voice that made my blood run cold. I tried to break free, but it was too late. I couldn't escape the house, the darkness, the curse that had been passed down from Mr. Walters' family to anyone who dared to get too close. Everything went black.
Next story.
I'll never forget the day it all started. It was a regular Friday afternoon when my world turned upside down. The kind of day where you don't expect anything out of the ordinary until you do. I had just moved into a small house in the suburbs. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A modest two-story with a white picket fence, a small yard, and a long driveway. The neighborhood was quiet, just the way I liked it. There were a few houses nearby, all spaced out enough to give a sense of privacy. It seemed like the perfect place to start over, away from the chaos of city life. But little did I know, the people I thought were my neighbors were hiding dark secrets. Secrets that would soon make me question everything. It was about a week after I moved in when I first met Mrs. Crowley. She was the woman next door, the one with the faded blue shutters on her house. I was out front, unpacking boxes when she came over, a glass of iced tea in her hand, wearing a smile that looked a little too wide, like it was permanently painted on. Her voice was sweet, but there was something about her that made me feel uncomfortable, like she was sizing me up. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, her voice thin but friendly. "I live just next door. My husband, Paul, and I have been here for years. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's nice to meet you." I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I should have trusted my instincts. I should have asked questions, tried to get to know her better. But I was new, eager to settle in and start my life over. The days passed, and Mrs. Crowley would occasionally stop by with baked goods or offer help with things around the house. She seemed nice enough, but she had this odd way of looking at me sometimes, like she was watching me, waiting for something. It was around 2 weeks after I moved in that things started getting weird. It was late at night, and I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone when I heard a faint noise. It was like a tapping sound, light but persistent, coming from the wall behind my head. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the creaks and groans that every old house makes at night. But it wasn't a typical creak. It was rhythmic, almost like someone was tapping their fingers gently, methodically, against the wall. I turned my head and stared at the spot, my heart beginning to race. I got out of bed and moved closer to the wall, pressing my ear against it. The tapping continued, slow and steady. I checked the hallway, but it was empty. No one else was home, just me. My mind raced, and I tried to dismiss the idea that anything strange was going on. It was just the house, just my imagination running wild. I climbed back into bed, convinced that I was being paranoid. The tapping continued for the next few nights. Always the same rhythm, always the same faint sound, like fingers drumming on the wall. I never got used to it, but I convinced myself it was nothing more than a weird sound that old houses make. I tried to ignore it, but it gnawed at me. Then, one night, as I was sitting in the living room watching TV, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was just a shadow at first, something moving at the edge of my vision. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I got up and checked the front door, the windows, everything, but there was no sign of anyone. The street outside was empty, the houses quiet. I went back inside and tried to shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, Mrs. Crowley came over again, this time with a strange gift, an old antique mirror framed in gold. It looked like something out of a Victorian house, the kind you'd see in a dusty thrift store. She insisted that I hang it in the living room, said it would bring good luck to the home. I didn't know what to say, but I didn't want to offend her. So I took it, reluctantly, and placed it on the wall where she suggested. As soon as the mirror was up, I felt a shift. The atmosphere in the house felt different, heavier somehow, like there was something in the air. I couldn't explain it, but I started to feel a growing sense of unease every time I walked past it. The mirror was beautiful, but it gave off this strange, almost sinister energy. It felt as if it was alive, watching me. That night, the tapping on the wall came again, but this time it was louder, faster. It echoed through the house, reverberating in my chest like a heartbeat. I jumped out of bed, my pulse racing. I ran to the wall, pressing my ear to it once again. The tapping stopped abruptly, but then I heard something else. A whisper, faint but clear. "Help me. Help me." The voice was barely audible, but it sent chills down my spine. I pulled away from the wall, my mind reeling. I backed away from the bedroom, my heart thudding in my chest. The whispering continued, now coming from all directions. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking to me. I ran down the stairs, feeling like I was suffocating. I couldn't escape the noise, the whispers, the sense of being surrounded by something, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I looked at the mirror again, the way it reflected the room behind me, showing shadows where there shouldn't be any. I reached out to touch it, but as my fingers grazed the surface, I felt a coldness that made me pull back. It was like touching ice, sharp and unnerving. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My reflection wasn't the same. It was blurry, distorted, like someone else was standing behind me, their face hidden in the dark. I ran out of the room and straight to Mrs. Crowley's house, desperate for answers. I knocked on the door, my hands trembling. She opened it with that same wide smile, like she had been waiting for me. "Is everything all right?" she asked sweetly. I don't know. "There's something wrong with the house," I stammered. "The mirror and the tapping. It's like something's here with me." Mrs. Crowley's smile faltered for a moment, but only for a second. Then she stepped aside, ushering me inside. "Sit down, dear," she said, her voice low and comforting. "You're not the first to hear it." That's when she told me the truth. The house I had moved into wasn't just old, it was cursed. And it wasn't just the house. The entire neighborhood had a dark history, one that stretched back generations. People had lived here and vanished without a trace. Neighbors who had once lived in the houses around me had disappeared, their fates unknown. The ghosts of those who had died in these homes were still here, trapped between the living and the dead. She told me the tapping was the sound of the spirits trying to communicate, reaching out for help. But the real horror lay in the mirror. It was an ancient artifact, a portal of sorts, a way for the dead to cross over into the living world. She had known that once the mirror was placed, I would begin to see things, feel things that weren't there before. I felt my stomach drop as she explained that the spirits weren't just reaching out for help, they were trying to take me. The house, the mirror, the tapping, it was all part of a ritual, a slow process of possession. And the spirits weren't going to stop until they had me. That night, I gathered all my courage and made my way back to my house. The mirror glowed faintly in the dark, its surface reflecting a world that no longer felt like my own. The tapping had started again, faster now, almost frantic. But this time, I didn't run. I stood there, staring into the mirror, waiting for something to happen, and then it did. The shadows in the mirror began to move, twisting, shifting, forming into figures. Faces appeared, pale and twisted, their eyes hollow and staring, their mouths open in silent screams. I could hear their whispers in my head, louder now, demanding that I join them. I knew then that I couldn't stay any longer. I couldn't fight it. As the figures reached out from the mirror, I felt a coldness consume me. The whispers grew deafening, and I felt myself being pulled in, drawn into the darkness. Just before everything went black, I heard a voice in my ear, a whisper, soft and chilling. "Welcome home."
Next story.
I don't know how to explain this, but I've been living in my current house for about 2 years now. At first, it seemed like the perfect place, a nice, quiet neighborhood, friendly neighbors, and a peaceful atmosphere. But soon, I realized that not everything was as it seemed. The horrors that followed made me wish I had never moved here. It all started with Mrs. Turner, the elderly woman who lived next door. She was an odd one, but I never thought much of it. I'd see her standing at her window, staring out, even in the middle of the night. At first, I thought maybe she had trouble sleeping, but something about her gaze unsettled me. It was almost as if she was waiting for something. One evening, I was out in my yard, cutting the grass, when she approached me. She was hunched over with a cane, but her steps were surprisingly quick for her age. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" she said, her voice cracked but warm. I smiled politely, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Yes, it is. How's everything going, Mrs. Turner?" Her eyes narrowed slightly as she looked over at me. "Oh, just waiting for the night." That last part caught me off guard. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect from an elderly woman who lived alone. I laughed it off nervously and went back to mowing the lawn, but that comment stayed with me. The next few days, I began noticing strange things. The lights in Mrs. Turner's house would flicker on and off late at night, but it wasn't just a regular occurrence. It was erratic, like someone was messing with the switches. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a loud bang coming from her house, followed by what sounded like footsteps dragging across the floor. I felt uneasy, but didn't think much of it. The real terror began a week later. I had been out late at work and came home to find my porch light on, which I never leave on. As I walked up to the door, I noticed the window next to the door was open. Just a crack. It wasn't like that when I left earlier. My heart started to race and I quickly stepped inside, locking the door behind me. It was a warm evening, so I decided to go to bed with the windows open. I had this strange feeling I wasn't alone, like something was watching me. That night, I was jolted awake by a soft scratching noise coming from the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate scraping against the glass. My blood ran cold. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window. No one was there, but the air outside felt unnervingly cold. I shook it off, telling myself it was just an animal. But as I lay back down, I noticed something strange. Across the street, Mrs. Turner's lights were flickering again. I could see her silhouette standing motionless in front of the window, her eyes locked on me. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept my eyes on the window, waiting for something to happen. But the night passed quietly. The following day, I went about my normal routine, trying to push the strange events from my mind. But when I came home that evening, I noticed something different. My front door was slightly ajar. I had definitely locked it before leaving. I stepped inside cautiously, feeling my heart beat faster as I checked every room. Everything seemed fine, until I walked into the kitchen. The kitchen window was wide open, and there in the middle of the floor was a single item, a black crow feather. I don't know why, but that feather made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a feather, it felt like a message. I felt like someone was toying with me, but I couldn't understand who or why. I looked out the window and saw Mrs. Turner again, standing by her window, staring at me with that eerie gaze. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. I was constantly on edge, feeling like I was being watched. And then things took a darker turn. One evening, I was sitting on my porch trying to relax when I saw Mrs. Turner standing in her yard, facing me, She was just standing there, unmoving, like she was waiting for something. Then, without a word, she slowly began to shuffle toward my house. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly got up and shut the door behind me, locking it. But then the knocking began. It started softly at first, just a tap on the door, but then it grew louder, more persistent, as if she were demanding to be let in. The knocking turned into banging, and I could hear her voice calling my name. "Let me in, child, let me in." I froze in fear. Her voice didn't sound like Mrs. Turner's anymore. It was deep, raspy, and unnatural. It didn't feel like her. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way out. I ran to the back door, but just as I was about to open it, I heard something that made me freeze in place. The voice was coming from the window. "Let me in. Let me in." I slowly turned around and saw her face pressed against the window. But this wasn't Mrs. Turner anymore. Her eyes were wide, bulging, and her skin was pale, stretched taut over her face, like something was wrong, like her features didn't belong. Her mouth twisted into a grin that was far too wide, revealing teeth that were sharp, like something predatory. I backed away slowly, my breath caught in my throat. I could hear her laughter outside, low and guttural. I didn't know what to do, so I grabbed my phone and called the police. But before I could say anything, I heard the voice again, this time louder and more demanding. "Let me in. Now!" The police arrived shortly after, but by the time they got to my house, Mrs. Turner was gone. There was no sign of her, and the officers thought I was just imagining things. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what was out there, lurking in the dark. Days passed, and the haunting didn't stop. Every night, I'd hear scratching at my windows, banging on the doors, and her voice calling out to me. I started to lose my grip on reality, questioning whether I was being driven mad or if something truly sinister was happening. It wasn't until I spoke to the neighbor across the street that I got some answers. I asked her if she had seen anything strange happening around Mrs. Turner's house. She hesitated for a moment, then leaned in close. "You don't know, do you?" she whispered. "Mrs. Turner, she died years ago. That house is haunted by her spirit. But it's not just her. It's something far worse." Apparently, Mrs. Turner had died in her home, alone. The neighbors said she'd been a kind woman, but after her death, strange things began to happen. People who moved into her house were never seen for long, and those who did stay reported hearing strange noises, feeling an oppressive presence, and even seeing Mrs. Turner's ghost, always watching, always waiting. But the worst part? She wasn't alone. The spirits of the others who had died in that house over the years were trapped with her, and they were growing restless. I had unknowingly moved into a cursed home, and it was too late to leave. Mrs. Turner's ghost wasn't just haunting me. She was trying to drag me into the darkness with her, to make me one of them. Now, every night, I can hear her voice. It's getting closer. Her whispering calls to me from outside my window, and I know that I'm running out of time. The house has become a prison, and no one has ever escaped its grasp. I don't know what happens next, but I can feel her presence growing stronger, inching closer with every passing hour. I only hope that someone will hear my story before it's too late.
Next story.
I'd always been the kind of person who believed in logic. Ghosts, spirits, things that go bump in the night. They were just stories, overactive imaginations, fueled by too much horror television and late-night campfire tales. I didn't believe in any of it. That is, until I met the person who lived in the house next door. It was a typical suburban neighborhood. My wife and I had just moved into a cozy little home on Maple Street, looking forward to starting our life in a peaceful community. The neighbors were friendly, the houses well kept, and the air smelled like fresh grass. We were happy. Until the house next door came into play. It had been empty for months when we moved in. The house was older than the others, with sagging gutters and a porch that creaked in the wind. It wasn't in horrible shape, but it was clear no one had taken the time to maintain it for a while. The lawn was overgrown, and there was an old, rusted swing hanging from a tree in the front yard. It didn't bother me at first. I figured someone would buy it sooner or later, and the place would be fixed up. A couple of weeks after we moved in, I noticed someone pulling into the driveway of the house next door. A tall, thin man with dark hair stepped out of an old sedan. He had a scruffy beard and a worn leather jacket. His name was Henry, as he later introduced himself. At first, I thought he was just a regular guy, maybe a little rough around the edges. He didn't say much when we met, just nodded politely and mentioned he'd been away for a while, but he was finally back to settle in. He seemed okay, but there was something strange about him. His eyes, for one. They were unsettling. Dark, almost hollow, like he wasn't fully there. Over the next few weeks, I'd see Henry outside, working on the house, but he always seemed to do his work late in the evening or at night. He'd hammer at the walls, run electric wires, or fix the shutters long after the sun had gone down. I thought it was a bit odd, but again, I figured maybe he was just busy during the day and the work needed to be done. One night as I was sitting in my living room, I saw Henry through the window, standing on his front porch. He was just staring at the house, staring at it for hours. His eyes never moved, never blinked. He didn't even seem to notice the time pass. At first, I thought he might be waiting for something or someone, but the longer I watched, the more it unsettled me. Something about the way he stood there, motionless, unblinking, felt unnatural. The next day I saw him again, this time coming out of the house with a strange wooden box under his arm. He didn't notice me watching, but when I saw the box, a chill ran down my spine. It was old, scratched up, and locked with a rusty brass latch. He hurried into the house with it, and I didn't see him for the rest of the day. A week later, I started hearing strange noises in the middle of the night. At first, it was just faint knocks, soft, methodical tapping coming from the direction of Henry's house. I assumed it was just him working on something, maybe some old pipes or a creaky door. But the noises didn't stop. They got louder. And then one night, I woke up to hear what sounded like dragging. It was slow, deliberate, like something or someone was being pulled across the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I walked over to Henry's house, my heart pounding as I approached the front door. The lights were on inside, but there was no sign of life. I knocked 3 times, hesitated, and then knocked again. After what felt like an eternity, Henry opened the door. His face looked tired, but his eyes were still that hollow, faraway stare. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "Hey, Henry, I've been hearing some strange noises at night. You're not, doing any work at odd hours, are you?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder toward the dark hallway behind him. A shiver ran down my spine. "No," he said finally, his voice low. "Nothing strange, just the house. You know, sometimes these old places make noises." I nodded, but I didn't believe him. There was something he wasn't telling me. Before I could say anything else, he stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. Against my better judgment, I did. As soon as I crossed the threshold, I felt the air grow heavy, almost suffocating. The house smelled of dust, damp wood, and something else, something faintly metallic. The walls were lined with old photographs, many of them yellowed with age. But what caught my attention was the large wooden box sitting in the middle of the living room, resting on a pedestal. "What's that?" I asked, pointing to the box. Henry's eyes flickered nervously, but he quickly composed himself. "It's just an old family heirloom, been passed down for generations. It's nothing special." I didn't buy it. There was something about the way he said it, like he was hiding the truth. I stepped closer to the box. It was beautifully carved with intricate symbols, none of which I recognized. There was a heavy padlock on it, and the surface looked worn, as though it had been handled many times. I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like I wasn't supposed to be there. Henry must have seen my discomfort, because he quickly moved to stand in front of the box. "Don't worry about it," he said quickly, forcing a smile. "I'm just taking care of some family business." "Okay," I muttered, my voice tight. "Well, if you ever need any help or something, just let me know." He nodded, but as I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, so soft I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. It was like a voice coming from the box, low and almost pleading. "Don't leave." I froze. I glanced back at Henry, but he didn't seem to hear it. I wanted to ask him about it, but the words caught in my throat. I quickly made my way to the door, not daring to look back as I left. That night, the noises grew worse. The dragging sounds, the tapping, the whispers. It was all coming from Henry's house, and it was getting closer, like something was moving in the walls, creeping toward me. I tried to block it out, to tell myself it was all in my head, but it was too real. I knew now, whatever was in that box, whatever Henry had brought with him, was something evil. It had followed him here. The next morning, I woke up to find the house next door completely silent. The windows were dark, the front door locked. I knocked several times, but there was no answer. I waited for hours, but still nothing. Finally, I called the police. When they arrived, they forced the door open. Inside, the house was empty. No sign of Henry. No sign of anything except for the box sitting in the middle of the living room. I never saw Henry again. The house was left abandoned, and after a while, it was sold to new owners. But every now and then, I still hear those dragging noises, faint whispers, and the tapping that comes from the direction of that house. I don't know what happened to Henry, but I know this. Whatever was in that box is still there, and one day it will find its way back to me.
Next story.
I had always thought that living in a quiet town would be peaceful. That was, of course, before I moved into the old farmhouse on the edge of Mill Hollow. When we bought the place, it seemed like a steal. The house was cheap, far cheaper than anything in the area, and the land came with it. A few acres, mostly forested. The house itself was a big, two-story place, built in the 1800s, but well-maintained. It was perfect for my wife, Sarah, and me. We had plans to renovate it, to start fresh. We were excited. At first, everything felt just as idyllic as I had imagined. The neighbors were welcoming, the sky was always clear, and the only sound you could hear on a quiet night was the wind rustling through the trees. But there was one thing I couldn't shake, an unsettling feeling every time I stepped outside at night. It wasn't just the silence, it was something else. Something lurking just out of sight. It started on the first night we stayed there. We were unpacking in the living room, our dog Daisy sitting by the window, when I heard a noise from the forest. It was a faint, distant sound, like someone or something was walking through the underbrush. I told myself it was probably an animal or maybe a neighbor out for a late-night stroll. But Daisy's ears perked up and she started growling. Not a playful growl, but a deep, cautious growl, the kind she did when something was off. I went outside to check, calling her to follow me. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the wind shifted and the temperature dropped by several degrees. The night air felt thick and heavy, like the earth itself was holding its breath. There was no one in sight, and the forest stood still, but Daisy wouldn't leave my side. Her growl turned into a low whine, and I could tell she was spooked. I figured it was just a deer or something. After a few minutes, I ushered her inside and locked the door, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that something wasn't quite right. The next few nights were similar. Faint noises, rustling from the woods, and Daisy's uneasy behavior. But then, it got worse. I was sitting in the living room one evening reading when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the front porch. Not the gentle creak of the old wood under someone's foot, but the heavy sound of boots, something deliberate. It was around 11 p.m., far too late for anyone to be out here. I looked out the window, but there was no one. I went to the door cautiously and peered through the small crack. The porch light flickered, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing just outside the reach of the light, tall and thin, barely visible. It wasn't a neighbor, I could tell that much. It was too late for anyone to be out this far, and the figure was unnaturally still. I opened the door, calling out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" No answer. The figure didn't move. I stepped onto the porch, feeling a sudden cold sense of dread. But when I reached the spot where the figure had been standing, it was gone. The porch was empty. I closed the door quickly and locked it, heart pounding in my chest. Sarah had been upstairs, but when I told her what had happened, she didn't seem as concerned as I was. "It's probably just someone playing a prank," she said. "Maybe a local kid or, well, I don't know, but you're probably just tired." I tried to believe that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something about that figure wasn't right. It didn't feel human. The stillness, the way it had stood there without moving, it felt like it was watching me, waiting. The days passed, but the unease remained. Daisy wouldn't go near the back door, and every time we went outside, she would start growling at the trees as if something was out there, just beyond the line of sight. At night, the sounds continued. The rustling from the forest, footsteps on the porch, and that unsettling silence that would fall over everything. One evening, after a particularly long day of unpacking and cleaning, I sat down on the porch with a drink to try and relax. The air was cool, and for the first time in a while, I thought maybe I could shake this feeling. Maybe everything had just gotten to my head. But then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate step on the porch. I stood up instantly, my pulse quickening. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a flashlight and swung the door open, shining the light out onto the porch. There, standing just outside the circle of the porch light, was the figure again. Tall, gaunt, with a face that seemed more shadow than flesh. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, but its eyes, those eyes, burned with an intensity that chilled me to my core. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice shaking. There was no response. I took a step forward, but as I did, the figure seemed to melt into the darkness. One moment, it was there. The next, it was gone. Vanished, like smoke in the wind. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking and my mind was racing. This wasn't some prank. This wasn't a person. There was something wrong with this house. Something old, something dark, something that I couldn't explain. The next morning, I decided to go into town and speak to someone who might know about the place. I went to the local diner, where I ran into Mrs. Ellsworth, an older woman who had lived in the area all her life. I mentioned the house to her, and her face went pale. "You're in that old house on the edge of Mill Hollow, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low and strained. I nodded. "Yeah." "Why? What's wrong with it?" She hesitated before speaking. "There's a reason that house has been empty for so long. It's not just the isolation. It's the land. The land around that house, well, it's cursed. Long time ago, before your house was built, there was a family who lived there. People said they were strange, quiet folk who didn't mix with others. But one night, the youngest daughter, Lily, disappeared. Never found her. They say something in those woods took her." I felt a cold wave wash over me as she spoke, and my mind began to race. The stories were always the same: a restless spirit, a cursed place, a family destroyed. It seemed like a tale straight out of a ghost story. But the way Mrs. Ellsworth spoke, her tone filled with something close to fear, it made me believe it. "Some folks say Lily still haunts that house. The footsteps, the whispers you hear in the trees, it's her. She's out there, waiting for someone to listen, someone to understand." I felt my stomach drop. The figure on the porch, the whispering in the woods, it all made sense now. I wasn't being haunted by a random ghost or a trick of the light. It was her, Lily. That night, I didn't sleep. The house was quieter than ever, but the feeling in the air, something old, something lingering, kept me awake. And the footsteps? They didn't stop. Every night since then, they've come. The whispers from the woods, the figure on the porch, and the eyes burning with that cold, inescapable intensity. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. I don't know what Lily wants, but I do know one thing: she's not going away. Not until she's found what she's looking for.
Next story.
I had no idea what I was getting myself into when I moved into the old house on Maple Street. It wasn't much to look at, small, weathered, with peeling paint and an overgrown lawn. But it was cheap, and I was in need of a place to stay. I didn't ask many questions, and that was my first mistake. The neighbors seemed friendly enough at first. Across the street was the Taylor family, young with 2 kids running around, always playing in their yard. Next door to me, though, was a different story. The house there was dark, with a constant fog around it, even on clear days. The lawn was unkempt, and the windows were covered with thick curtains so you could never see inside. The woman who lived there, Mrs. Clausen, never left her house. I saw her only a handful of times, always looking out the window, her expression unreadable. I thought she was just an eccentric old lady, and I didn't think much of it. But then the noises started. It began one night when I was sitting in my living room. It was late, around midnight, and I was reading a book. I heard faint footsteps outside, followed by soft whispering. I thought it was just my imagination at first, but when it happened again the next night, I started to feel uneasy. The sounds would always come around the same time, just past midnight. Footsteps and whispers, as if someone was walking right outside my door, but no one was ever there when I checked. I tried to dismiss it, but my mind couldn't help but race. One night I decided to confront it. I opened the door and stood in the dark, listening. The sounds were louder now, unmistakable. Someone was definitely walking, and I could hear the whispering voices, though I couldn't make out any words. I stepped out onto the porch, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw Mrs. Clausen's house. The lights in her house were on, but the curtains were drawn, like the windows dark and impenetrable. I thought I saw a shadow moving behind one of the windows, just for a second. A tall, thin figure, its shape distorted. But before I could think, I heard the footsteps again, this time from behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and I shivered, despite the warmth of the summer night. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. That was the first time I felt truly afraid in that house. The next few days were more of the same. The footsteps, the whispering, and the feeling of being watched, especially at night. But what really disturbed me was the way the neighbors acted. The Taylors, who had always been so friendly, started to avoid me. I'd wave to them as I passed, but they wouldn't wave back. When I ran into them at the grocery store, they would glance over their shoulders nervously, like they were afraid of something. It didn't take long before they completely stopped acknowledging me. And then it happened. One night I was lying in bed when I heard something different. A knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was already past midnight. Hesitant, I got out of bed and tiptoed to the door, looking through the peephole. There was no one there, but the knock had been clear, and it hadn't come from the door. It had come from the side of the house. My blood ran cold. I crept through the dark hallway toward the back door. The knock came again, louder this time, from right outside the window. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. There was something wrong, something that I couldn't explain. Gathering my courage, I opened the back door, stepping into the cold night air. The yard was quiet, eerily still. I walked toward the edge of the yard where the woods began. The knock came again, but this time, it wasn't from outside. It was coming from deep within the trees, echoing through the dark. I was about to turn back when I noticed something. In the distance, I saw a faint light moving through the trees. At first, I thought it was a firefly, but as it got closer, I realized it was a lantern. A small, flickering light moving through the darkness. It wasn't a person. The light was floating, drifting in the air as if held by an invisible hand. I stepped back, the hairs on my neck standing on end. As the light came closer, I saw something else, a figure. It was a woman, dressed in tattered white clothes, her face obscured by a dark veil. She was walking slowly, her feet barely touching the ground, her body moving with an unnatural jerking motion. The lantern swayed as she approached, its light casting strange shadows on her face. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, as the woman came closer, her head tilting as if she were looking right at me. And then the whispering started again. This time it was clear. The voice came from all around me, coming from the trees, the wind, the very earth beneath my feet. "Help us." The words echoed in my mind, loud and hollow. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and that's when I heard it, the voice of Mrs. Clausen calling from her house. "Leave her alone." I ran back toward my house, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me, but I could still hear the whispering growing louder, coming from every direction. I fell to my knees, clutching my chest as I tried to steady my breathing. The next morning I went to the Taylor's house, desperate for answers. They were outside, sitting on their porch, but when I approached them, they looked at me with a mix of fear and pity. "You need to leave," the father, Mr. Taylor, said, his voice trembling. "You don't understand what's going on. It's not safe here." I asked them what he meant, but he wouldn't tell me. Instead, he urged me to pack up and go. It wasn't until later that I learned the truth. Mrs. Clausen hadn't been alone in that house for years. The neighborhood had been plagued by mysterious disappearances, strange happenings, and a general feeling of unease for decades. It wasn't just Mrs. Clausen who had lived there. It was her family, her husband, and children, who had all died under horrific circumstances, and when Mrs. Clausen died, the spirits of her family remained, trapped in the house. But they weren't the only ones. The spirits of those who had moved into the house before me were there too, lost and restless. The whispers, the knocks, and the figures in the dark was reaching out, trying to pull me into their world. I packed up and left that night. I didn't even say goodbye to the Taylors. I knew I had to get out before it was too late, and as I drove away, I looked back one last time at the old house on Maple Street. The light in Mrs. Clausen's window was on, and I saw her standing there, her face pressed against the glass, staring out at me with that same unreadable expression. But this time I could hear the whispering, louder than ever before.
Next story.
It started with the old house next door. It wasn't the type of house that caught your attention in the daytime, but at night when the wind was howling and the moon hung heavy in the sky, it stood there like a forgotten sentinel. You know the kind. Weathered wood, crooked shutters, the kind of place that's seen better days but still holds a strange sense of dignity in its decay. I had moved into the neighborhood a few months earlier, but I'd never paid much attention to the house. It was just another old place on the block. That is, until I met the neighbor who lived there. Or, I should say, the neighbor who used to live there. Her name was Mrs. Harper. She had lived in that house for as long as anyone could remember, and it was said she kept mostly to herself. Her yard was always tidy, but there was something unsettling about the way she kept to the shadows, never coming outside during the day unless it was absolutely necessary. The neighbors always spoke of her in whispers, like they were afraid to mention her name too loudly. One afternoon, when the sun was setting, I saw her standing on her front porch. She was dressed in black, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun. She was staring at me, her eyes wide and intense. Something about the way she looked at me made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't a friendly look. It was as if she was studying me, evaluating whether I was worth her time. But I just waved, trying to shake off the strange feeling. It was a few days later when the first strange thing happened. I was sitting in my living room, enjoying a quiet evening, when I heard a soft knock on the door. I opened it to find no one there. I figured it was some kids playing a prank and shrugged it off. But when I turned to head back inside, I noticed something strange. A small envelope lying on the ground, just inside the doorframe. It was plain, unmarked, and yet it felt as though it had been placed there deliberately. I picked it up and opened it, expecting maybe a note from a neighbor or a flyer, but there was nothing inside except a single black feather. I thought it was odd, but didn't give it much more thought. It wasn't until later that week when I found another one, this time tucked into my mailbox, and then another left on my doorstep. The feathers kept appearing, each one a little more ominous than the last. They weren't just any feathers, they were large, jet black, and glossy, unlike anything you'd see from a typical bird around here. And with each new feather, the strange feeling in the pit of my stomach grew. Finally, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went to Mrs. Harper's house, my curiosity getting the better of me. I knocked on her door, and after a long silence, she answered. She was standing in the doorway, her face expressionless. "Yes?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. I just wanted to ask if you know anything about these feathers," I said, holding one up. "They've been appearing on my doorstep." Mrs. Harper's eyes flickered to the feather, and for a moment I thought I saw something that wasn't quite right. Her lips curled into a tight smile, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "Be careful, dear. You've been noticed." The words sent a chill down my spine, but before I could respond, she turned away and shut the door. I stood there for a moment, staring at the house, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I felt a creeping sense of dread settle over me. I wasn't sure what she meant by noticed, but I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't a good thing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was eerily quiet, and the wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows. But it wasn't the storm that kept me awake. It was the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of dark shadows moving in the corners of the room, always just out of sight. I tried to shake it off as nothing more than my overactive imagination, but the feeling didn't go away. Around 3 a.m., I heard a sound, a soft scratching at my window. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and went to the window. There was nothing outside. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the glass. It was Mrs. Harper, standing in her yard, staring directly at me, her face hidden in the shadows. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark, cold and unnatural. My heart raced as I pulled the curtains shut, but the image of her face was burned into my mind. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I went to work with a heavy sense of unease, but when I returned home, things had taken a much darker turn. My front door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to notice. My stomach twisted in knots as I stepped inside. The The house was silent, too silent. And then I saw it. The feathers. They were scattered across the floor, leading down the hallway like a twisted breadcrumb trail. I followed them, each step heavier than the last. The trail led to the basement door, which I had never dared open since moving in. It had always felt like something was lurking behind it, but I had always dismissed it as just another irrational fear. Not anymore. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open and the smell of mildew hit me. I stepped inside, the darkness swallowing me whole. There was a faint light at the far end of the basement, coming from what looked like a small lamp. As I approached, I noticed a figure standing in the corner of the room, draped in shadow. My heart skipped a beat. It was Mrs. Harper. She was muttering something under her breath, her hands raised as if she were holding an invisible object. Her eyes were closed, her face twisted in concentration. The black feathers surrounded her, forming a circle on the floor. As I stood there, frozen in terror, I realized she wasn't alone. There were other figures, dark, indistinct shapes, standing around her, their presence barely perceptible in the dim light. "Get out," she whispered, her voice low and guttural. "It's too late for you." I turned and ran, the darkness closing in behind me. I burst out of the basement and slammed the door shut. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I packed my things and left. I couldn't stay there anymore, not with Mrs. Harper, not with whatever evil she had invited into my life. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. And there she was, standing in the window of the old house, watching me leave. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the sight of her. It was the shadow that moved behind her. It wasn't human. It was far darker, and it was following me.
Next story.
I had always considered myself a rational person. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but that was before I moved into the old house on Elm Street. People in the neighborhood had warned me about it, of course. They said it was haunted, that it had a dark history, but I brushed it off. Who wouldn't? It was a beautiful house with classic architecture and a grand front porch. It had been vacant for years, and the price was too good to pass up. I remember the first night I spent there. It was quiet, almost eerily so. There was no traffic noise, no sounds of people outside, just an unsettling silence. I chalked it up to the fact that it was a small, older neighborhood. As I unpacked, the house felt cold. Not temperature-wise, but emotionally. It was as though the walls were holding on to something buried deep within the structure. That night, I fell asleep in the master bedroom, the one with the large bay window that overlooked the street. I was exhausted from the move, so I drifted off easily. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the footsteps were too distinct, too rhythmic to be mere creaks. They were heavy, like someone was walking around upstairs. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. But the sounds didn't stop. The footsteps grew louder, moving back and forth across the second floor. It wasn't long before I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Someone or something was in the house. I jumped out of bed and grabbed a flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood still for a moment, straining to hear the sounds. The footsteps continued, now heading toward the stairs. I swallowed hard, then cautiously made my way down the hallway, my flashlight shaking in my hand. When I reached the stairs, I hesitated. The thought of going upstairs alone made my stomach churn, but I had no choice. I needed to know what was going on. I slowly ascended the staircase, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I reached the top, I noticed something strange. The door to the attic was wide open. I hadn't opened it. In fact, I hadn't even noticed it before. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. My feet moved on their own, drawing me closer to the attic door. With a deep breath, I pushed it open. The air in the attic was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. The room was empty, except for a single chair in the corner. The chair was old, with peeling paint and a worn cushion. But what caught my attention was what was sitting on it, an old, tattered doll. It looked almost lifelike. The doll's eyes were open, staring blankly ahead. Its clothes were faded and torn, and its hair was matted and tangled. I couldn't explain it, but there was something about that doll that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a door slamming shut behind me. My heart leapt into my throat as I spun around, my flashlight beam searching the dark attic. But there was no one there. I was alone. I ran back downstairs, my breath ragged, my body trembling. I locked every door and window in the house, convinced that something was wrong, terribly wrong. But as I lay in bed that night, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, I heard it again. The footsteps. They were closer this time, moving around the hallway outside my bedroom door. I knew I had to get out of the house, but for some reason, I stayed. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the belief that if I just ignored it, it would go away. But it didn't go away. It got worse. The next few days were a blur of strange occurrences. I would wake up to find things moved around, pictures on the walls crooked, books knocked off shelves, the lights flickering without explanation. I started hearing whispers at night. They were soft, faint, but they were there, just on the edge of my hearing. Sometimes I could make out words that didn't make sense, like a language I couldn't understand. But the worst part was what happened one evening when I was sitting in the living room. I had been watching TV, trying to distract myself from the fear that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The house was quiet, too quiet, but I didn't want to acknowledge it. I kept my eyes on the screen, hoping that the silence wouldn't break. And then it did. The doll. The same one from the attic. It was sitting on the coffee table in front of me. I froze. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. There was no way it could have gotten there on its own. I hadn't moved it. But there it was, staring at me with those cold, lifeless eyes. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted up from the couch and grabbed my phone, ready to call someone. Anyone. But as I reached for the door, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of laughter. It was high-pitched and childlike, echoing throughout the house. I turned to look, and in the reflection of the hallway mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small figure was standing at the end of the hallway. It was a little girl with long, dark hair and a white dress. Her face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel her eyes on me, piercing, cold, watching. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The girl stepped forward, and that's when I saw it. In her hand, she was holding the doll. The same doll. I screamed and ran out of the house, not looking back until I reached my car. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, but even as I drove, I couldn't shake the image of that little girl and the doll in her hand. It was as if they were following me, haunting me. I never went back to that house. I couldn't. And I hope no one ever moves in there again, because there's something in that house, something old, something sinister, that will never let you leave. And the worst part, the doll, it's still out there waiting for the next person to come along.
Next story.
I had always believed that I was safe in my own home. It was just a little house on a quiet street, a place I had rented for the past 3 years. The kind of place where the neighbors waved when you passed by, and the only noise at night was the distant sound of crickets. But everything changed when the new neighbors moved in. It was a rainy afternoon when I first saw them. A moving truck was parked in front of the house next door, and the new tenants were unloading their belongings. There was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a short-cropped beard, and a woman with dark hair wearing a long green coat that seemed out of place for such a dreary day. They looked normal, but there was something about the way they moved that didn't quite sit right with me. It was like they were constantly on edge, constantly watching. They introduced themselves to me later that evening after the rain had stopped. The man, whose name was Tom, was polite but distant, while the woman, Rachel, gave me a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. It felt like they were hiding something, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Over the next few days, I tried to brush off the odd feeling I had about them. They kept to themselves, and their house was always dark, even at times when it should have been lit up. I thought maybe they were just reclusive, like some people were. But the more I observed, the stranger things seemed. I would notice the curtains twitching as if someone was watching me through them. Every time I glanced over, Tom would be standing at the window, staring out into the street. He never waved or acknowledged me, just watched. And sometimes I would hear strange sounds coming from their house, scratching noises in the walls, low murmurs that could have been voices, but were always too muffled to understand. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A loud bang, followed by a scream. It was coming from next door. I shot up, heart racing, my thoughts a blur. I could hear footsteps pounding across the floor, followed by more muffled sounds, but nothing that sounded like normal activity. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. It was as if everything had gone back to normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, I saw Rachel standing outside staring at the house. Her eyes were wide and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. When she noticed me, she quickly turned away and walked back inside, but not before I saw the strange, haunted look in her eyes. That night, the noises from their house grew louder. It was a constant scratching, like something or someone was clawing at the walls. It sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, called the police, and waited by the window for them to arrive. By the time the officers pulled up, the house next door was silent again. No signs of disturbance. But as the officers knocked on the door, I could see Rachel standing in the window, watching them. There was something about her expression that made my skin crawl. She didn't look worried. She didn't look scared. She looked satisfied. The officers spoke to Tom and Rachel for a few minutes before they left. They didn't seem concerned, as if they hadn't heard the same noises I had. I watched them walk back inside, the door closing behind them with a quiet thud. The next morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I knocked on their door, determined to find out what was going on. Rachel answered, her face tight as if she were holding something back. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cold. "I heard some strange noises last night," I said, trying to sound casual. "Is everything all right?" She hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously to the side. Then she shook her head and smiled, but it was a strange, forced smile, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "We're fine," she said, her tone flat, "just a misunderstanding." I didn't believe her. Something was definitely wrong, and I had to find out what. The next evening, when it was dark and quiet, I decided to sneak over. I had to know. I had to see if the strange noises were real, or if it was just my imagination. I crept quietly across the lawn, staying out of sight. When I reached their house, I went around the back and peered through a small crack in the blinds. What I saw froze me in my tracks. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that I didn't recognize, drawn hastily in what looked like black chalk. The room itself was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, but what caught my attention the most was the shadow moving across the floor. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. He was hunched over, crawling on all fours, his movements jerky and unnatural. His back was bent at an odd angle, and his eyes, those eyes, were wild, unblinking, staring straight at me through the window. Before I could move, the blinds shifted, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from inside. I spun around, my heart racing, and darted into the bushes just as the back door creaked open. I crouched down, holding my breath, praying they hadn't seen me. I heard their voices, low and whispering, but I couldn't make out the words. After what felt like an eternity, the door slammed shut again, and the house fell silent once more. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My mind raced, and I kept thinking about the man. No, the creature, crawling on the floor. I didn't know who or what it was, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The next morning, I packed up my things, grabbed my cat, and left without a word. I didn't even bother to say goodbye to my neighbors. I couldn't. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the window of the house next door, watching me leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. I never returned to that street. I couldn't. But sometimes when the wind is just right, I still hear the faint scratching, a reminder that something is still there, watching, waiting.
Next story.
I had never thought much about my neighbor, Mrs. Blanchard. She was the kind of person who kept to herself, always behind closed curtains, always quiet. I had lived in the neighborhood for a year, and in all that time, she had only spoken to me once. It was a brief, cold conversation when I first moved in, a polite hello, followed by a pointed remark about how much noise the wind could make in the neighborhood. At the time, I assumed it was just the weather, or maybe she was just an odd person. But the weirdness began after I found the note. It was an ordinary Tuesday when I got home from work, carrying my bags and groceries, and there it was, slipped under my front door. It was folded neatly, the edges crisp, and the handwriting was precise, almost deliberate. It read, "Don't trust Mrs. Blanchard. She is not who she seems. You should leave before it's too late." I was confused. I didn't know who it was from, but I assumed it was some kind of prank. I shrugged it off, told myself it was a joke, and went on with my evening. However, the next few days were different. Mrs. Blanchard's house, which had always been quiet, seemed to hum with an eerie energy. I began hearing strange noises, scraping sounds coming from her yard in the middle of the night. Low whispers as though people were talking, but always too faint to make out. The strange thing was, no one ever came or went from her house. There were no visitors, there were no cars in the driveway. Yet every night the noises grew louder. It wasn't long before I started seeing things. One night as I sat on my front porch, I noticed a figure standing in her window. At first it was just a silhouette, barely visible against the dim light inside. But the more I stared, the clearer it became. It wasn't Mrs. Blanchard. It was a man, tall with a gaunt face wearing a dark suit. I blinked and the figure was gone. The next day, I noticed Mrs. Blanchard's front door was slightly ajar. I had never seen it like that before. A chill ran through me, but curiosity got the best of me. I didn't want to be nosy, but I decided to walk over and knock. As I approached her door, I was struck by the smell. Decay, almost. It wasn't strong, but it was there, like something forgotten. When I knocked, there was no answer, but the door creaked open just enough to invite me inside. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to leave or to investigate. But something strange compelled me to step inside. The house was darker than I expected. Dust covered the furniture, and there was a layer of grime on the floor. It felt like no one had lived there for years, but the place was well maintained, too well maintained almost. There were no pictures on the walls, only bare spaces. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness. I moved slowly, my footsteps echoing through the empty house. I called out softly, "Mrs. Blanchard?" But there was no response. I ventured deeper into the house, passing through the living room and into a hallway. That's when I saw it, the door at the end of the hall. It was slightly cracked open, the faintest sliver of light escaping from the room, the same light that had drawn me here. A soft buzzing sound, like an electric hum, came from behind the door. I approached cautiously, reaching for the handle. As my fingers brushed against it, the door swung open on its own. The room was small, cramped even, with only one piece of furniture, a large wooden chest. It sat in the center of the room, half covered in dust. The humming sound grew louder as I stepped closer to it. I felt my heart race, my breath quickening. There was something inside that chest, something that felt wrong. I didn't know why, but I had to open it. As I lifted the lid, the air grew cold and a sudden wave of nausea hit me. Inside the chest was a bundle of old, tattered cloth. It was wrapped tightly, as though something was bound inside. I reached for it with trembling hands, pulling the cloth back. What I saw made my stomach drop. It was a body, a shriveled, decayed body. The face was barely recognizable, but the unmistakable features of Mrs. Blanchard were there. Her eyes, wide open, stared at me, though she was clearly dead. Her mouth was frozen in a grimace, as if she had died in pain. The body had been preserved, almost as though someone had gone to great lengths to keep it from decomposing. I backed away from the chest, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Why had she? The hum grew louder, and then I heard something else, footsteps behind me. I spun around, my blood running cold. Mrs. Blanchard was standing in the doorway. She looked exactly the same as always, dressed in her dark, old-fashioned clothes, her hair perfectly done. But her eyes were hollow, empty. There was nothing in them but a deep, dark void. And she wasn't smiling. She was watching me. "You shouldn't have opened it," she whispered, her voice soft and cold, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I backed up, stumbling over my own feet, my breath shallow and ragged. I couldn't look away from her eyes, though every part of me screamed to run. "What is this?" I gasped, my voice trembling. Her lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was twisted, wrong. "She's been waiting for you," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "And now you're part of the family." Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, and the house seemed to close in on me. I turned back to the chest, and to my horror, the body inside was no longer still. It was moving, slowly, twitching like it was trying to get out. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back on my porch, gasping for air. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew I would never step foot inside that house again. To this day, I can't forget what I saw. Mrs. Blanchard's eyes, the body in the chest, the strange, cold hum of the room. I don't know how long she's been dead or how she still walks around the house, but I can feel her presence watching me from across the street. And sometimes late at night, I hear the hum again. It's faint, but it's there.